Good morning. Welcome to our online church service. I'm Diane. I'm a member of First Congregational United Church of Christ in Waterloo, Iowa, and I'm the worship leader this morning. I'm very glad that you've chosen to spend some time with us and share our service with us. We're currently awaiting the arrival of our interim minister in August, and until then we will have members of our church family leading the services online. You can reach those services either on Facebook or YouTube at any time, and we encourage you to share that link with friends and family. Please join me in the call and response. Proclaim with me the Lord's greatness.
Let us praise his name together.
I prayed to the Lord, and he answered me.
He freed me from all my fears.
The helpless call to him, and he answers.
He saves them from all of their troubles.
Let us pray. Dear God, we know in our hearts that you created us, you love us, and you are with us always. And yet, sometimes, we doubt that you really have time for us, or that you're really even listening to us. There are so many things in this world right now that scare us and pull us away from you. Keep reminding us, God, that we need you every day. Our communities need you. Our leaders need you. Our world needs you. Please guide our thoughts and actions to encourage understanding and acceptance of others. Give us patience with the process of change, and give us strength and compassion to stand up and make a difference in our world. Amen.
Today, we're going to tell a story where you are this little monkey. And in this story, you're going to be walking down a trail, having a good time, and who do you see? It's a snake. What do? Here's what I would do. But then you turn back around and you realize the snake has a rock that's stuck on its tail. It can't move. It's hurting. If no one helps this snake, it could die. So as the monkey, you have a choice. Do you want to be the type of monkey that goes and runs away? Or do you want to be the monkey that lifts the rock off the snake's tail so the snake can slither away? Thank you, monkey.
The New Testament reading today comes from Luke, chapter 10, verses 30 through 37. Jesus answered, "There once was a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when robbers attacked him, stripped him, and beat him up, leaving him half dead. It so happened that a priest was going down the road, but when he saw the man, he walked on by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite also came there, went over and looked at the man, and then walked on by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was traveling that way came upon the man, and when he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. He went over to him, poured oil and wine on his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own animal and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. 'And when I come back this way, I will pay you whatever else you spend on him.' And Jesus concluded, 'In your opinion, which one of these 3 acted like a neighbor toward the man attacked by the robbers?' The teacher of the law answered, 'The one who was kind to him.' Jesus replied, 'You go then and do the same.'" Old Testament reading today is from Jonah, chapter 3, verses 1 through 5 and 10. Once again, the Lord spoke to Jonah. He said, "Go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to the people the message I have given you." So Jonah obeyed the Lord and went to Nineveh, a city so large that it took 3 days to walk through it. Jonah started through the city, and after walking a whole day, he proclaimed, "In 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed." The people of Nineveh believed God's message, so they decided that everyone should fast, and all the people, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth to show that they had repented. God saw what they did. He saw that they had given up their wicked behavior. So he changed his mind and did not punish them as he said he would.
Good morning. My message today is about love over fear. Love is but a song we sing, and fear is the way we die. This is a lyrical phrase from Youngblood's song, "Get Together." It was released the month I was drafted into the armed services in 1969. I learned it. Remember the refrain? Come on, people now. Smile on your brother. Everybody get together. Gonna love one another right now. Well, I was chosen to call the marching cadence in boot camp that spring. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. I tried to get together into it for my drill sergeant. Come on, people now, smile on your brother. Everybody get together, gonna love one another. 2, 3, 4. My drill sergeant didn't care for it. He was not a fan of it. Said it wasn't the right fit. So it never made it to the parade ground. But for being a pop culture protest song, the lyrics were actually pretty deep. The song presents love and fear as ways of living, and it claims it is a choice that we make about how we live out our lives. We can live by fear or we can live by love, and it claims we hold the key to both in our trembling hands. Well, I've dragged those lyrics around for about 50 years. They're loose ends. But more recently, I've had the time to try to tie them up a little bit, and I thought I'd take this chance to share my knot with you. Many of my reflections were spurred by a book called Love Over Fear by Dan White, and he wrote it in 2019. It was published by Moody Press. But Jesus, of course, had lots to say about love and fear, and much of that informed Dan White's work. But let's look at what Dan White had to say about fear first. He claims that fear motivates much of our behavior, and he says that many of us deny being motivated by fear because it makes us look weak. People in marketing, however, know that commercial sales are actually motivated well by fear. Fear of aging, for example, sells everything from anti-wrinkle cream and hair dye to cosmetic surgery. Fear of illness sells everything from hand sanitizers and antibacterial soap to billions in antibiotics. And fear of being sued sells billions of dollars worth of insurance. So fear of other people sells weapons from pepper spray to assault rifles. It even puts us in gated communities if we can afford it. So fear is big business, and it tends to call the shots when it's in play. Well, Jesus thought his followers were fear-driven. He asked as many as 40 times in the Gospels, "Why are you so afraid?" In fact, "fear not" is the most frequently repeated command in Scripture. It occurs 365 times, one for each day of the year. Are we as afraid today as they were in the times of Jesus? Well, the answer is probably yes. We call it being concerned today, or we find things worrisome, or we find other things problematic, but these are often code words for fear. We insure just about every aspect of our lives, don't we? From our houses to our health to our cars. We don't call it fear. We call it risk assessment, but it's fear. So what's wrong with a little fear? Well, a little fear makes us cautious, and that's not all bad, but it depends on the kind of fear we're talking about. I mean, this morning we're not talking about fear of coiled snakes or barking dogs or nasty viruses. It's fear of people and fear of motives, fear of us versus them. It's a fear that tends to polarize us, and polarization breeds hate. Well, Christ preached against hate. Christ came to earth to teach us that hate is evil. Personally, I think that's mostly why he showed up. Well, polarization splits us apart, creates our side and their side. Polarization can pull apart a nation, split up a congregation. It can tear apart a family, cause a divorce. It can even come between a mother and a child, especially if it involves cages on the border. It's nasty stuff. Rampant runaway fear breeds polarization, and once polarization occurs, it feeds on fear. So fear is the fuel that feeds the fires of hate. The psychology of polarization is kind of interesting. It's a product of an immature thought pattern, actually. We all had a stage in our lives as children when things were either or. Kids might go through a stage where they claim to love only one parent. Maybe they only love mom, not dad, for 1 week. And then the next week, they only love dad and not mom. Carl Jung, the psychologist, called it one-sidedness. And he says it creates false choices. He found it typical in preschoolers. Well, if you talk to preschoolers about their favorite ice cream, for example, you'll find that lots of them claim to not like vanilla. And you ask them why, and they'll say, because I love chocolate. They can't just prefer one. They have to either love it or hate it. Most of us get over that, don't we? Especially when it comes to ice cream. Well, one-sidedness or polarized thinking can extend into the adulthood of some very intelligent people. I had a boss once who struggled for months trying to get a foothold in managing his workforce. At one point, he called me into his office and he told me to take a seat and asked me if I was for him or against him. I said I was neither, and he said that wasn't permissible. I had to choose. It was either or thinking that preschoolers are stuck with, but adults are not. Unlike children, adults don't have to place everything and everyone in categories of good and bad or black and white. Well, if we conceive of the area between the poles of a divided populace, like in the United States, if we conceive of that area as space, what can invite people into that space, that gray area? To look for common ground, because that's what it's going to take, is common ground. The scriptures tell us that Jesus occupied that space, and he held it. He held it through love, not timid love, no milquetoast stuff. He used bold and courageous love. You know, Jesus' 12 disciples were not of one ilk. This was a disparate group of individuals and with very different backgrounds and very different temperaments. They could be a quarrelsome group, and they were frequently jealous for the attention of Jesus' favor. More than one author called them misfits, as a matter of fact. Well, Jesus traveled with them. He ate in close quarters with them. He slept beside them. He was in constant contact with them over years. He interrupted their debates. He modeled mediation and he modeled love, and that dissolved the polarization and permitted this group to function. Jesus' love permitted that odd group to remain together, and it is really they who bring us much of Christianity to the world. The disciples wrote the books, many of the books of the Bible. Without the disciples, we wouldn't know much about who Jesus is today, actually. Well, what part of Jesus' message made that happen? It was his message of God's love. One of the greatest challenges of Christianity is generating bold and courageous love for people who reject it, people who oppose us. Love for our enemies, as they call it. Dan White calls it enemy love. I mean, loving your spouse, loving your family, loving your friends, your dog, your cat. That's the easy part, isn't it? Christians boldly claim to do these things, but let's face it, most everybody does these things. What makes Christianity unique is Christ's perplexing command to love our enemies. I mean, who does that? Well, there are many references in Scripture to loving the enemy. A Google search turns up dozens of sightings, mostly all in the New Testament. One is the Good Samaritan. This is a bold love for a Samaritan, from a Samaritan for a Jew. It qualifies as enemy love because Jews hated Samaritans. Another story is Jesus with the woman at the well. He shows her bold and courageous love, the love of a Jew for a Samaritan in this case. Well, we find us versus them scenarios. When we find those, Jesus is usually busy breaking them up, not exploiting them. Not so much true for the Old Testament. I mean, this is the story of Abraham and Sarah and the tribes of Israel and their struggles as people with God. Us versus them in the Old Testament is pretty commonplace. Us is the Jews and them is about everybody else. But there's a rare exception that it appears in the enemy love in the story of Jonah. Recall that a whale swallows Jonah for 3 days and nights until he agrees to obey God, whereupon he gets spit up onto the beach. It is best known actually as a children's Bible story because of the fish part mostly, and maybe the spit part. But it's an unfortunate because those two parts are probably the least important parts of the story. We find it, more of it in 2 Kings. Jonah is the only prophet in the Bible to not do what God has commanded him to do. Scholars believe Jonah, as a prophet of the Lord, advocated building a wall on the eastern border of Israel to protect it from vicious attacks from Assyria, just to the east. Well, Assyrians were known as aggressive and warlike and acquired much of their wealth, enslaving their captives and selling them to others in the region. God described them as having wicked ways. Jonah is commanded to go to Nineveh, which is the largest city in Assyria, and inform those warlike Assyrians to mend their evil ways or suffer God's consequences. Well, Jonah appears to not have thought this was a very good idea. He apparently preferred the wall option. Well, we surmise that because he runs in the opposite direction and buys a passage on a boat to Spain, which is west. There's a big storm, of course, and Jonah gets thrown overboard, and that's about where the fish comes in. But this is a story about fear, not fish. Fear of the Assyrians and God's agape love for these Assyrians. God doesn't want to destroy them unless he has to, and he wants to send Jonah to talk to them. Jonah believes he knows these Assyrians well enough to think that this diplomacy is not going to work. And when it doesn't, Jonah doesn't trust God to be able to, or to want to follow through with his threats. And he tells him so. It's going to leave Jonah pretty vulnerable, isn't it? Well, as it turns out, Jonah eventually does go to Nineveh with God's message, and things turn out for the best. But this is a rare enemy love story, and it's in the Old Testament, and it's not a fish story. It's the story of Jonah. In fact, this story of Jonah is both in the Koran and also in the Bible. A temple was erected on Jonah's burial site to celebrate the success of his diplomacy with the Assyrians. The temple survived centuries as a symbol of God's love for both sides of the divide between Jews and Arabs. It was so important that ISIS actually destroyed it in 2014 because they thought it threatened their message of hate for the infidels. But Jonah is a story about courage and fear and love, God's love for the Assyrians. So you remember my loose ends that I was going to tie up, choosing love over fear? Well, if we combine love with courage in a knot, and then we'll watch fear and hate fall away from that knot. I believe that was Christ's message on the cross. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Christ needed to come into the world to model this extraordinary sentiment for his followers, because it's the hardest love of all, and we need to see it in order to believe it. It may be this kind of love that the song lyrics talk about as the key that we hold in our trembling hand. Amen. Join me now, please, for prayers of the people. We come to you this morning each of us one of your children. No matter how the screen may dress it up or not dress it up, we know that each of us is one of your children. No matter what the world says or what the world thinks about us, we know that we are your children. No matter what institutions say, Congress, the governor's office, the CDC, the White House, what they proclaim, what they decide, how they legislate, no matter, we know that we are your children. Despite today's news, Lord, despite a global pandemic, despite a virus ravaging the world scene, despite whether we wear masks or we don't wear masks, despite the polarized state of our national and local politics, despite protests on the street, despite all that, we know that we are your children, Lord. There is no thing or no one who can separate us from the truth that we are someone, that we are family, that each one of us is meant to be here now in this electronic space. Your child, Lord. You are the Father and we are the children. Join me now, please, in the prayer that our Father has taught us. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. To conclude our service today, I'd like to offer an Irish blessing. It's one of my favorites. May the road always rise to meet you. May the wind always be at your back. May the sun warm your face. May rain drop softly on your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Amen.